Hey everyone, so I wanted to hop on and make a quick video here about the Module 3 discussion, which is about designing a care plan based on a case study that is in your textbook on page 64. So I've had some questions about kind of how to figure out what the three components would be, because in the textbook it doesn't necessarily give you like a list, let's say, of what different components would be. So this is going to require you to kind of think outside the box and be able to identify what some key aspects of this case are on your own. So if you look at the discussion prompt, the first thing that you're asked to do, it says identify three key components that you would include in a care plan. Take into consideration the sociocultural factors, sequence of trauma events, and the responses to traumatic events. Be sure your key components address the client's acute and ongoing needs. So that's the first part, and that's going to be the main portion of what makes up your discussion post for Module 3. So there's a part 2 that talks about self-care, but we'll get to that in just a minute. So when it comes to identifying these three key components, before we think about that, we want to think about this care plan. And so for some of you, depending on what kind of work you currently do, if you work in the mental health or substance use field and human services, you might be familiar with what a care plan is, but commonly what you'll hear instead of care plan is a treatment plan. And so when a client comes in, whether it's for mental health treatment, substance use, or some other type of services, you're always going to have, or most times, what's called a treatment plan. And so basically, in order to get a treatment plan, you identify the client's issues, what their needs are, and then the treatment plan consists of interventions or things that you can do to help meet those needs that have been identified. So if we're thinking about this case study in terms of a treatment plan, the first thing that you would need to do is identify what the issues are. So if we go over here to the case study, I'm not going to read through all of this. You can read through it yourself. But there are some things that I'll just kind of call attention to. So the first thing is that we know that this client is a 22-year-old female mandated to outpatient mental health and substance use treatment as a diversion for going to either jail or prison. Says she was arrested and charged with assault after arguing and fighting with another woman in the street. She's only 22, but she reports a 7-year history of alcohol abuse, a depressive episode at 18, so 4 years ago. She was surprised she got in a fight, but she was under the influence at the time. She has a history of severe physical abuse from the ages of 4 to 15. So a period of 11 years. It says she's very detached when she talks about her history of trauma. She doesn't want to participate in group treatment because she doesn't want to show her emotions. Her education is limited. She feels very disconnected from others. She doesn't think that she needs treatment, so we know that at this point her insight is very limited. She denies having feelings about her abuse, has flat affect. The other group members feel like she doesn't show much empathy. So all of those problems are contributing to the treatment that she has been mandated to participate in. So that's something that's important to keep in mind. So now that we've looked at that, I'm going to approach this from the perspective of what I would do if I were going to complete this discussion if I was a student. So what I would do after reading this case illustration is I would get a piece of paper and I would start to list out the issues that I see when it comes to this client and her functioning. So I wouldn't try to focus on just 3 at this point. I would list out all of the different things. So on that list, just to give you like some ideas, would be trauma from 4 to 15, 7-year history of substance use, alcohol use specifically, a history of a depressive episode, lack of education, let's see, aggressive behavior when under kind of the influence of alcohol, legal issues. So obviously she's participating in treatment as an alternative to incarceration. So that means there's probably some type of plea deal that's been arranged, but there's some charges that maybe she has pending that if she doesn't participate in treatment, will kind of stick on her record, so to speak. Another issue is that she's struggling with the current form of treatment. She's struggling with, it sounds like, detachment, disconnection from her emotions. So that's a pretty good list of issues that she's currently facing. So once I have that list of kind of issues that are impacting this client, I would go through that list and start to pick out kind of 3 overarching themes that are present that I think are of the highest priority to address in a treatment plan for this client. So ones that students will commonly pick out would be mental health treatment, substance use treatment, trauma, education. Those are just some common ones. But again, it's your individual take on a treatment plan for this client. And so ultimately, you can choose whatever 3 components. But when it asks for like what are 3 key components, you can kind of think about that in terms of what are 3 of the primary kind of categories. What are the kind of the 3 categories that we would want to focus on for treatment? And that's where you're going to start with this. So once you've identified kind of what 3 of the highest priority issues are, you could then arrange your post by making a paragraph, at least a paragraph on each of those 3 components. So let's say that you chose as your first component trauma. So you think that's an important component of this client's story that needs to be a focus in the treatment plan. Then paragraph 1 would be on trauma. So what we could do is we can look at your textbook, and one area that you might want to focus on here would be specifically looking at trauma and numbing, let's say. So this is a biological process that's related to traumatic events. And so here it even highlights that in the case illustration with Sadhana, that numbing is evidenced by her limited range of emotions associated with interpersonal interactions and her inability to associate emotion with her history of abuse. She also possesses a belief in a foreshortened future. How do we know that? Because down here in the case study, it says that, let's see, that she doesn't understand why she was mandated to treatment. There are several different things that indicate that she isn't able to think about the future in a positive way. She doesn't think she needs treatment. She denies having any difficulty. She feels very disconnected. And so she's not able to think about goals for the future. She's very much kind of in the here and now in survival mode. So as part of this component of addressing the trauma, you might highlight numbing and how that's significantly impacting her kind of daily functioning, her quality of life. You could then go on to talk about some of the other challenges that she's facing specifically as a result of the trauma. So you might then talk about something like hyperarousal and how this is the body's way of remaining prepared. We know that she was involved in a physical altercation And so that could potentially be impacted, well, obviously by the fact that she was under the influence of alcohol, but also that her body is in a state of hypervigilance, right? She was abused during her very formative years from the ages of 4 to 15. And so we know that whenever you experience physical trauma like that, especially, and it doesn't even have to necessarily be just physical, but when you experience prolonged trauma like that, it causes an increase in cortisol levels, which it talks about over here. And when we have kind of an increase in hormone levels like cortisol over extended periods of time, that has a negative impact on the body. And again, that's going to change kind of her, the sensitivity of her nervous system. And so she's always going to be on the lookout for, who is the next person that's going to hurt me? What's going to happen? How can I prevent that from happening? So you might bring that up in the section on trauma. So once you've identified what some of those kind of issues are related specifically to trauma in that first paragraph, you could then close out the paragraph by talking about what some appropriate interventions would be. So if we go back over here, it asks you, as you're identifying the 3 key components for the treatment plan, that you take into consideration sociocultural factors, sequence of trauma events, and responses to traumatic events. So again, part of how you might integrate some of this information into that first paragraph would be to talk about the sequence of trauma events. So again, like I just mentioned, the fact that she experienced trauma from the age of 4 to 15, you could talk about how that has impacted development, so like physically, how that's impacted her, the long-term physical impacts that might be there, how that has impacted her emotionally and kind of her worldview. So as you're looking at what these key components are, you can find different ways to weave in talking about sociocultural factors, the sequence of trauma, and then the response to the traumatic event. So what you could do again is identify the 3 key components, break that up then into the paragraphs, and then within each of those paragraphs, talk more specifically about factors that relate to those key components. So again, if trauma was going to be paragraph 1, you could talk specifically about the numbing behaviors, hyperarousal, and then again end with what some appropriate interventions may be. And so you've been looking in your readings about different types of appropriate treatment interventions. And so let's see, for specifically chapter 3. Oh, something else I would call your attention to is maybe integrating some information on something like this. So the consequences of early childhood trauma. Obviously, that's going to be relevant to Sadhana's case. So this has information about adverse childhood experiences, which if you look over here on the Module 3 overview, there's an infographic that talks about ACEs or adverse childhood experiences, how prevalent they are, the impacts, and we'll talk more about ACEs further on in the class. So I would really encourage you to read all of chapter 3 to help specifically with this discussion. Then it talks about co-occurring disorders again, so that's where you could kind of look at the interplay between mental health issues. So we know, again, she's had that depressive episode in the past, and substance use. So within chapter 3, you're not going to see a ton about interventions, but we already know from the previous chapters that you've covered that it briefly touches on what some interventions would be. And also in the Module 3 overview, it talks about some effective treatments for trauma victims. So you don't have to focus like incredibly heavy on what interventions would be, but it's something that you need to mention because, again, we're looking at what is going to be relevant to include in a treatment plan here. And so you might note that for trauma, as some of you have in the previous discussion, that in a treatment that you might want to include in this treatment plan and intervention would be something like EMDR, for example. And then you can go to your textbook, see where it talks about different treatments, and then add that information in. So there's plenty of opportunities here for you to be able to, within each of those 3 paragraphs, integrate information from your required reading, so from chapter 3 of the textbook, but then also some of the other readings for this week. So for example, one of the readings that's given to you as a required reading, so this isn't optional but required, that corresponds directly to the discussion, is this right here. So practice guidelines on responding to a mental health crisis. If you go down to, let's see, page 5 or page like 10 of the actual document, it talks about how to respond to a mental health crisis. So these are things that you could, again, weave, principles and ideas that you could weave throughout your discussion of those 3 key components. So, like this talks about avoiding harm, responding in person-centered ways, addressing trauma. So it talks about it's essential that once physical safety has been established for a client, that harm resulting from the crisis or crisis response is evaluated and addressed without delay. Establish feelings of personal safety. Look at what strengths the client might already have. Looking at the whole person. And then principles for enacting essential values, having access to supports and services that are timely, least restrictive environment, meaning that we always want to allow the client as much freedom and independence and autonomy as possible when looking at their treatment plan options. So all of this information is really good to, again, take into consideration and to weave throughout your discussion. And again, when you utilize that information and incorporate it, that's going to allow you to then show that the information that you're including in your discussion is evidence-based. And so you could cite this. Someone had asked a question about if part of the key components had to do with the 6 guiding principles to a trauma-informed approach from SAMHSA and the CDC. So it's not so much that that these 6 things that you would like pick out 3 of them as key components, but again, just like the information that I just showed you from that one supplemental reading, these are things that you might want to think about mentioning within each of like those 3 paragraphs. If you choose to break each of the key components up into a paragraph, you might, like under, let's say, again, going back to the example I use, if you were going to talk about trauma as one of your key components, you might talk about empowerment, voice, and choice. So how important it is that, clients who have experienced trauma, which, is correlated to a lack of power and control, that it's really important to allow them to have some type of say in what their treatment is. And so that builds on empowering them, giving them a voice and as much opportunity as possible when it comes to treatment, which again, the empowerment here from this model can also correspond to over here, providing services in the least restrictive environment as possible, and looking at, the whole person. So again, all of this you can kind of weave together. So what we're looking for with this discussion, it's not so much that you would identify the wrong 3 key components, but whatever the key components are that you identify, you just need to be able to make an argument and support with evidence why you think those 3 key components should be prioritized over other components that you might have included. And so that's where we get into down here on point 3, it says provide a rationale for your identified components. And so how you provide a rationale is that up here, when you talk about the 3 components, again, you explain, this is why this is so important. So for Sadhana, you would want to talk about, if you were going to do a paragraph on trauma, you would want to make a case for why that's so important. Why is addressing the trauma important? And so that's where you would go back to the textbook and maybe look at information that talks about the effects of trauma, how it negatively impacts people, how that, the different the different aspects of how a person would be impacted. So physically, how would they be impacted? Emotionally, how would they be impacted? So again, you're wanting to just make sure that you provide a good argument. So as long as you identify 3 components and then you have a good explanation for why you chose each of those 3, that's supported with evidence from like either assigned course readings or readings that you find on your own, then that's what we're looking for. So you just need to be able to make a case for each of the components that you choose. And again, as you're looking at what the components are going to be, think about her acute or short-term needs and what ongoing needs are going to be. And that can help you decide how to prioritize, the needs that you've identified. For part 2, identify one self-care method you would likely utilize when working with Sadhana and explain why you would use it. Okay, so it's really important that when you answer this portion or address this portion of the prompt, that you are talking about a self-care method that you as the provider would use for yourself. So I have made now 2 discussion posts on this, and I'm still seeing people talking about self-care as what the client would do. And we can all participate in self-care, even clients, but here you're being asked to talk about self-care and how you would enact it as a provider. And so there is a post that I did on the 28th that talks about self-care, and there is an article linked there that talks about self-care, how it prevents burnout for providers. I made another post today that has a short, like 7 or 10 minute video on self-care strategies for social workers. So if you've already completed the discussion post, but you did not correctly complete the portion on self-care, then you need to go back and make changes before tomorrow when this discussion post is due, because if it's not, if the information isn't accurate, then that's going to impact your grade. So I even gave you an example from one of your peers that address this aspect appropriately. So make sure that you review both of those posts on self-care so that you can get, that you can maximize the amount of points you get by addressing self-care appropriately. So if anyone has any additional information that they need or any questions when it comes to the discussion post for this week, please go ahead and get your questions in, because your initial post is going to be due tomorrow the 16th by 11:59. And again, you're basing your discussion post on this case study here on page 64 of your textbook. So if you're struggling with anything, please let me know so we can address it as soon as possible. Thanks.